Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you here. And I must say from the very beginning that I will not do two things. I will not sing and I will not speak in Dutch. You're probably fortunate about the first, but unfortunately I don't speak Dutch, so I cannot address you in your language, so we'll make do with English. You might also think, really, what does a philosopher have to tell us about the environmental crisis? We have to act urgently, we have to develop technological solutions, and so on and so forth. But I think that there is an important role for philosophy because it can help us raise different kinds of questions. It can help us see in a different light the kind of framework in which we are acting and thinking collectively and individually. And in fact, with a kind of benefit of historical hindsight, also situate this framework within intellectual history and in fact human history. And so this kind of complex that I call the Phoenix complex has to do with a growing rift that I have come to diagnose, to see, between the current practices, discourses, solutions that call upon us to celebrate this kind of self-regenerating capacity of nature, to see nature both outside of ourselves and ourselves as well, ourselves as human beings, individual, social, and so on, as miraculous phoenixes that can regenerate from the ashes of destruction. So we continue thinking and acting as if the world is safe and sound in the face of all the violence inflicted upon it. No matter how much we burn it, no matter how much we burn ourselves, suffering from burnouts, for instance, the body, the mind, and the world outside of us is supposed to resurface, regenerate in a phoenix-like manner. So there's a lot of hope involved in this mode of thinking, and unconscious hope. We often don't really even realize that we are acting in this sort of framework. But it is a hope that might be becoming less and less justifiable given the finite and fragile conditions for a living and livable environment today. Right? And this is what I mean by the rift between these millennia-old ways of thinking and acting that are still active in us, on the one hand, and what the living and livable environment can actually tolerate in terms of the gargantuous quantities of emissions that are released into the world, CO2 emissions, mining, fracking, and so on. And that can really put into question this logic of the phoenix. So it might be time to realize that there is an irreparable damage done to the biosphere, to biodiversity, to the planet's fragile ecosystems that would not regenerate in a way that we hope, in the way of a miraculous phoenix. And yet resilience is the ideological keyword still today. It is no wonder that we are all supposed to be resilient in the face of all kinds of social cuts, financial cuts that are going on, just as the natural world is supposed to be resilient and rebound from all the devastation that is inflicted upon it. And so it might be time to realize that the ashes of our age are not fertile, are not fecund ashes that can stimulate the regrowth or regermination of life. And what I mean by that are the ashes that are left by human industries, by anthropogenic industries, such as soil degradation and depletion, microplastics, all kinds of non-biodegradable materials, radionuclides also released into the environment, and so on and so forth. All of this collectively giving a sort of identity to the geological age called the Anthropocene. So we might say that the Anthropocene is the age when human industries have filled the world with the non-fecund ashes from which the world would not really regenerate in a phoenix manner. And what I call the Phoenix complex is really a transcultural and transhistorical feature of virtually all societies since the Neolithic age. So if we trace it back to the first human practices, we can think about agriculture, slash and burn agriculture, when tracts of land are set on fire in order to then stimulate the growth of plants, agriculturally produced crops, with those ashes, right? That is why this is the kind of concrete background for the image of the world as a phoenix. And of course, it has already lost that kind of historical connection in our minds. Even the figure of the phoenix has dissolved into a complex that I call with its name, and yet it is still active. It is still effective. And things might be more active and more effective when they lose their recognizable identity and just melt into the subsoil of culture, into psychic life, and from there, unrecognized, direct much of our conduct and modes of thinking. So the image of the phoenix is a kind of solution to the problem that is universally shared by all cultures, which is the problem of death, the problem of mortality, the problem of finitude, and the continuation of life after death. It does not really postulate the idea that life would continue elsewhere, in the heavenly realm, let's say, or in the hellish regions, but that life would continue here below, on this earth, on this finite earth, even despite death and after death. And this is what the figure of the phoenix tells us. It gives us a kind of comforting solution to the meaning of life despite death, without necessarily canceling out death, but taking the sting out of it. Right, so the phoenix complex, in technical psychoanalytic terms, goes by the name of disavowal, something that entails a simultaneous acknowledgement and repudiation of reality. So we acknowledge the reality of death, but we repudiate its finitude by saying, yes, things die, we also die, but then everything regenerates and everything comes back to life in the manner of the phoenix. Right? So a lot of the work that is to be done, both philosophically and also practically, is working through these unconscious structures, these unacknowledged backgrounds that keep motivating us, keep influencing the way we think, both individually, as corporations, as states, as societies and communities. And one place in the history of Western philosophy where I see the clearest definition of the phoenix complex is actually a speech of Diotima, the woman who is forgotten but who is at the origin of Western philosophy. This is from Plato's Symposium, and Diotima is not present there, but her words are related by Socrates, who actually says that he is her student. So if we trace the lineage of Western philosophy from Diotima, then Socrates is her student, Plato is the student of Socrates, Aristotle is the student of Plato. Everything goes back to this hidden, erased origin. So Diotima herself is not present, but her words are relayed by Socrates, and this will be the only quotation I want to offer you today. And this is what Diotima says. In this way, everything mortal is preserved, not by remaining entirely the same forever, right? Preservation for mortals is not like keeping the same as a stone, not by remaining the same forever, which is the mark of the divine, but by leaving behind that which is growing old and passing away, something other and new after the kind of the aging one. By this means, mechane is the word Diotima uses. By this means, Socrates, what is mortal, the body and everything else, partakes of immortality, but what is immortal does so differently, right? So Diotima says that mortals too can partake of immortality by leaving something or someone behind themselves, something or someone after their kind. So this obviously refers to progeny, to children, not only of human beings, but also of plants and animals. Diotima includes the entire living world. But also in the case of human beings, we can be, according to Diotima and Socrates, pregnant not only in bodies, but also in souls. So ideas, works of art, laws, pieces of legislation, all of those are the kind of mental children that are left behind in the image of the soul or the mind that has given given birth to them, right? These are the two paths that Diotima offers. And so in these lines by Diotima, I think we can really diagnose the phoenix complex very well. This is the mechanics of life. She uses the term mechane, right? It's the means by which the mortals can participate in immortality. The mechanics of life, but also the machination of substitution, of leaving something or someone in the place of the aging and dying one. And it is very easy to overlook the mechanics and the machinations of the substitution, the trick where the one who is replaced is completely overlooked in her or his singularity. And we are saying what is really valuable is this excess that overflows the finite being, the excess of infinity, the potentiality to be, right? The genes or the potentiality to think. And this is what survives. And we can just overlook and put completely to one side the singularity of that being who is passing away, who is going to die, whether it's a human being or an ecosystem or a species, right? So long as we have the genes preserved somewhere, genetic bank of seeds that can at will be called upon to regenerate phoenix-like the species that has been lost, right? So even though it's a beautiful solution and a solution that we seem to embrace unconsciously, it can be quite unethical because it overlooks the singularity of the beings who are lost. And one of the very practical implications of this way of thinking is everything it has to tell us about the notion of renewability and renewable energy. This is why I'm saying that philosophy can really lead us to question some of the terms that we take for granted, some of the dogmatic ways of thinking, and to challenge ourselves to do better than simply repeat certain mantras, right? If we look at renewable energy, for instance, of course, it seems to be a much better solution than fossil fuels that are non-renewable. But as a category, renewable energy is quite a strange one because it includes both solar power, hydropower on the one hand, but on the other hand also biodiesels that are distilled from monocultures of plants, corn, for instance, or soybeans that are grown in a very damaging way, cultivated in a damaging way to the environment, then burnt en masse to distill biodiesel from them, and then this biodiesel is burnt again to derive what is called renewable energy. Cumulatively, this is actually much more damaging than even the extraction of resources called fossil fuels, right? And this, and still we include this under the heading of renewability, which is a kind of very practical instantiation, a very practical incarnation of the phoenix. Right, the idea that all of these resources can be renewed and we can burn them again and again and again. So in the remaining time, now that we have diagnosed the most important aspect of the phoenix complex, we can ask, what should we do about it? What can be done, really? And I think that we should definitely not succumb to nihilism or fatalism, but develop modes of thinking and acting beyond the phoenix complex, now that we are aware of it. So at the limit of non-renewability, an apt question to raise is how to transform the negative finitude of extinction and exhaustion of the earth and its resources into a positive finitude of existence, to value finitude for what it is, not to tease out the infinite out of finite beings and then discard them as really immaterial, as useless, but rather to cherish the finite in its finitude, whether in relation to ourselves or in relation to a living and livable environment, right? So that calls upon us to develop a completely different ethic than the ethic that is prevalent today. It calls for us to value the self-reinvention of life, not a self-reproduction, but a self-reinvention of life in what a French philosopher, Henri Bergson, calls creative evolution, which is one aspect of this fragile positivity. And of course, the ethical implications of this mode of thinking and acting that is free of the phoenix complex would not call upon us to develop an ethics of preserving the world for the future generations, even though that is definitely important. But we have to think about the value and importance of preserving it in the here and now for those, whether human or not, who are living today and not only into the future, right? So finally, and most importantly, care for the finite in its finitude pays extreme attention not to the potential which finite beings hold in themselves and contain, but to how those finite beings themselves are, including ourselves. Ethical action needs no reasons that exceed its recipient. We don't need to postulate this more of something that overflows finite beings. And least of all, does it need to rely on the inner excess of the future, of the recipient's fecundity or renewability. Practiced beyond the limits of the matrix of the phoenix complex, ethics meets the world as it is, or it would meet the world as it is, refusing to be blinded by the shimmer of the heavenly or earthly world to come. So we would need to encounter being on the brink of non-being in our relatively tragic here and now, and to draw sense from this encounter of fragile finitudes. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you.